The deal was as unceremonious as trading for a side of bacon or a new shovel. $10, cold and heavy, spun across the splintered surface of the saloon bar, their clatter a sound of grim finality. She stood beside the saloon keeper, a woman so small and still she seemed a mere suggestion of a person. Wrapped in faded cotton, her face was a pale, impassive mask, a canvas that concealed both a universe of pain and a stark emptiness. Her name, the saloon keeper grunted, was Leanne. She refused to look at him. Her gaze was lost in a deep crack in the floorboards, as if tracing a map to an existence far from this sun-scoured purgatory of dust and judgment. The air, thick with the stench of cheap whiskey and the palpable scorn of the onlookers, pressed in on them. To the other men in the saloon, she was an object of morbid curiosity, a piece of delicate, foreign porcelain to be bartered for and owned. To Gideon, she was a pragmatic solution. She was a pair of hands to work the homestead, a presence to fill the crushing silence that had descended when his wife's heart gave out a year ago. As he led her from the gloom of the saloon into the blinding glare of the street, her steps were so light they left no mark in the thick dust. She thought he was leading her to a back room, a violation she had been stealing herself for since the moment her life was sold. A barely audible whisper, a desperate prayer aimed at an empty sky, escaped her lips. "Please, just make it quick." Gideon heard it. The words, intended for no one, snagged in his mind like a thorn. He offered no reply, only gesturing with his head toward the waiting buckboard. The journey to his claim was a long, bleak expanse of silence, punctuated only by the groan of the wagon wheels and the desolate cry of a hawk circling a heat-shimmering sky. The land itself was as stark and unforgiving as the man who claimed it, a vast canvas of muted earth tones and brittle, dying grass, all of it shadowed by mountains that clawed at the clouds like broken teeth. His home was not a home, it was a structure. It was a box of rough-hewn wood built to defy the wind, and it possessed the same hollow, haunted quality as the man now standing before it, a stranger who held the deed to her life. Her first days passed in a ritual of silent observation. The cabin was a monument to grief, every surface coated in a fine layer of dust that softened the sharp edges of reality, as if the world itself had grown tired. On the dry sink, a single plate, a single fork. In a forgotten corner, a child's rag doll lay face down, its yarn hair matted and tangled. The air was stagnant, thick with the memory of a life that had been violently extinguished. Leanne began her work not with the clatter of purpose, but with a quiet, deliberate grace. She moved through the stillness like water seeping into dry earth, finding its own level without force. She started with the floors, the rhythmic scrape of the broom, the first domestic sound the cabin had heard in a year. Then she moved to the windows, scrubbing away a year's worth of grime until the pale afternoon sun could finally spill across the floor, illuminating millions of dust motes dancing in the air like restless, microscopic ghosts. Gideon watched her from the shadows of the barn, his calloused, capable hands hanging at his sides, feeling suddenly and profoundly useless. He had bargained for a servant, a functionary to fill the empty spaces in his daily routine. He had not anticipated this gentle, silent reclamation of a life. He watched her hands, small yet certain, as she kneaded dough on a floured board. Soon, a scent so deeply entwined with his past that it felt like a physical blow filled the small cabin, baking bread. It was the first warm, living smell to inhabit the house in 12 months, an aroma of simple, profound domesticity that began to chip away at the glacier encasing his heart. He ate the bread she left on the table for him without a word, but its warmth spread through his chest, a sensation so foreign he almost failed to recognize it. It was a communication without words, a language he had long forgotten, a simple offering that declared, "There is still life here." The quiet transformation continued, a slow and steady tide rising against the shores of his sorrow. One afternoon, while dusting the rough mantelpiece, Leanne's fingers brushed against a small, tarnished object tucked behind a stack of old almanacs. It was a silver locket, oval and smooth, its surface clouded by neglect. She opened it with care. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, one of Gideon, younger, his face broken by a smile, the other of a woman with kind eyes and a soft mouth. His late wife. The ghost who haunted every corner of the cabin. Leanne felt a sudden pang of empathy, a strange kinship with this unseen woman whose place she had, in some crude way, usurped. She did not hide the locket. Instead, she took a soft rag and a bit of ash from the hearth and sat by the fire, patiently and methodically polishing the silver. She worked until it gleamed with a soft, lunar glow, reflecting the firelight back into the room. She did not return it to the shadows. She placed it in the center of the mantel, propped upright, a quiet testament to a love that had once filled this desolate space. When Gideon came in from the biting cold that evening, his eyes fell on it instantly. He stopped dead, his breath catching in his throat. He saw not an act of replacement, but one of reverence. This quiet, foreign woman was not trying to erase his past, she was tending to it, honoring it. He walked to the fireplace and picked up the locket, its polished surface warm from the fire. For the first time, he saw her not as his purchase, but as a person, someone who understood the deep, unspoken grammar of loss. He said nothing, but a subtle shift occurred within him, the first significant crack in a long frozen river. His daughter, Clara, was a whisper of a child, a small shadow flitting along the edges of his life. She was 6 years old but carried the weary silence of an old woman, her laughter and light buried alongside her mother. She had watched Leanne from a distance, her large, dark eyes filled with a solemn curiosity. She saw the way Leanne moved, the gentleness in her hands as she mended a curtain or coaxed a flame in the hearth. One morning, as Leanne sat on the porch step carving a piece of scrap wood with a small knife, Clara approached. She stood a few feet away, a silent sentinel watching the slivers of wood fall away to reveal a shape. Leanne did not speak or startle her. She simply continued her work. When she was finished, she held out her hand. In her palm lay a small, roughly carved bird, its wings half spread as if caught in the moment between rest and flight. Clara hesitated, then stepped forward and took the bird, her small fingers closing around the wood. It was the first gift she had received in a year. That evening, as Gideon sat cleaning his rifle by the fire, Clara came to him, clutching the wooden bird. She was quiet for a long time before she spoke, her small voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room with the clarity of a bell. "Papa," she said, her eyes fixed on the fire. "Why is her face sad?" The question struck Gideon like a physical blow. He had only ever seen Leanne's face as a mask, a blank canvas for his own assumptions. He had never truly considered the life, the history, the sorrow that existed behind her eyes. His daughter, in her untainted innocence, had seen what he had refused to, that the woman in his house was not a commodity, but a fellow soul adrift in a sea of grief. He had no answer for his child. The small wooden bird became a bridge. Clara, emboldened by the silent offering, began to spend more time near Leanne. One day, Leanne produced a simple loop of string and, with a few deft movements, created a cat's cradle. Clara's eyes widened. Tentatively, she reached out, and Leanne showed her how to lift the pattern to create a new one. Soon, a soft, hesitant sound filled the cabin, a sound Gideon hadn't heard since the first frost took the last of the autumn wildflowers. It was Clara's laughter. It was not a loud, boisterous thing, but a delicate, bubbling joy that seemed to hang in the air like a promise. Gideon would watch them from a distance, seeing his withdrawn, ghostly child slowly reawakening under the patient, gentle care of this woman. He saw Leanne's own face soften when she looked at Clara, a genuine warmth finally breaking through the stoic mask. A complicated knot of emotions tightened in his chest, a deep, aching grief for what he had lost, a pang of guilt for what he had failed to provide his daughter, and a nascent, terrifying flicker of hope. He began leaving small tokens on the porch rail for them, a perfectly smooth river stone, a bright blue jay's feather, a wild apple polished on his sleeve. It was a new, unspoken language developing between the three of them, a fragile ecosystem of care built in the heart of a desolate world. As autumn bled into winter, the sky grew heavy and grey, the color of old iron. A storm was coming, a blizzard the old-timers spoke of in hushed tones, the kind that could bury a house and erase the world. Gideon worked tirelessly to prepare, securing the livestock and chopping a mountain of wood. Inside, Leanne was just as busy, sealing cracks in the walls with mud and cloth. The world outside shrank, disappearing behind a thick, swirling curtain of white. The cabin, once a symbol of isolation, now became their entire universe. It was on the second night, as the wind screamed and the snow piled in drifts against the door, that Clara began to cough. By morning, she was burning with fever, her breaths coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The storm had sealed them in. There was no doctor, no help. Gideon, a man who could face down a wolf or a harsh winter, was utterly, terrifyingly helpless. He paced the small cabin like a caged animal, his stoicism shattered by a raw, primal fear. He watched as Leanne, her face a mask of calm concentration, took control. She bathed Clara's forehead with snowmelt and brewed a strange, bitter-smelling tea from a pouch of dried herbs she had kept tied at her waist, coaxing the hot liquid past the child's lips. For 2 days and nights, they kept vigil. In the deep, dark hours of the second night, with the fire burning low, she finally spoke of her past. Her voice was a low murmur as she told him of a village by a different river, of a family who sold her to pay a debt, of a younger brother she had nursed through a similar fever, only to lose him. Her story was not a plea for sympathy, but a simple sharing of a burden. In that moment, united in their fear for the child, Gideon saw the full, terrible depth of her resilience. A deep, powerful wave of respect, fierce and absolute, washed over him, cleansing the last of his transactional coldness. The storm broke on the 4th day. A weak, watery sun emerged, turning the landscape into a blinding expanse of white. Clara's fever had broken in the night, and she was sleeping peacefully. A fragile, exhausted peace settled over the cabin. But it was short-lived. Later that afternoon, 2 figures on horseback appeared, dark smudges against the snow. Gideon recognized one instantly, Finch, the saloon keeper, a man whose grin was a mask for the cold ledger he kept in his soul. He and his companion reined in their horses near the porch, their presence an ugly violation of the hard-won sanctuary. "Heard you were snowed in," Finch called out, his voice slick with false bonhomie. "Just checking on my investment." Gideon stepped out onto the porch, positioning himself in the doorway. He said nothing. "Thing is, Gideon," Finch continued, his eyes flicking past him into the cabin, "I've had a better offer for the girl. Fellow over in Blackstone, willing to pay double. Our deal was more of a rental, you see. I'm here to collect her." Leanne, standing behind Gideon, flinched as if struck. The world, which had just begun to feel safe, was once again a place of terror. She saw the familiar predatory glint in Finch's eyes, and the cruel reality of her situation crashed down upon her. Gideon did not move, a silent, unmovable obstacle. His face was granite. Finch misread his silence as weakness. "Now don't make this difficult," he sneered, taking a step forward. "You got your use out of her." But the man he faced was not the same man from the saloon. The hollow shell had been filled. Grief had been replaced by a fierce, protective fire. When Gideon finally spoke, his voice was low and gravelly, carrying across the snow with the weight of absolute authority. "Get off my land." Finch laughed, a short, ugly sound. "I ain't leaving without what's mine." He reached for the pistol at his hip. In that instant, Gideon moved. He didn't draw a weapon. He took one step forward, planting his feet firmly, and placed his hand on the doorframe, symbolically sealing the entrance and shielding the 2 souls behind him. "She is not yours," he said, the words clear and precise. They hung in the frigid air, imbued with a power Finch had not anticipated. "This is her home." It was not a statement of ownership, but a declaration of belonging. It was a public choice, a definitive claim that had nothing to do with money. Finch looked into Gideon's eyes and saw not a grieving widower, but a husband and a father defending his family. He saw a line that could not be crossed. After a long, tense moment, Finch slowly lowered his hand, muttered a curse, and turned back to his horse. He knew a lost cause when he saw one. The 2 riders disappeared over the horizon, their tracks in the snow a temporary scar that would soon be erased by the wind. The silence that descended was different now. It was not the aching silence of grief, but the deep, quiet peace that follows a battle won. Leanne stood in the doorway, her hands pressed to her mouth, her eyes shining with unshed tears. For the first time in her life, someone had stood for her. Gideon turned and looked at her. All the walls between them had crumbled. He saw the fear and the disbelief and the dawning hope in her eyes. He walked toward her and slowly, gently, he reached out and took her hand. His calloused, rough fingers wrapped around hers, not a gesture of ownership, but of profound connection. Later, the three of them sat at the small table, sharing a simple meal. A shaft of pale winter sunlight streamed through the clean window, illuminating the polished silver locket on the mantel and the little wooden bird on the windowsill, its wings forever poised for flight. The cabin was no longer a tomb of memories, but a living, breathing home, warmed by a quiet love that had taken root in the most barren of soil. A man had purchased a servant, but in the crucible of a shared winter, he had found a wife, a mother for his child, and the unexpected, miraculous thawing of his own frozen heart. Their journey proved that even in the harshest wilderness, after the most devastating storms, a house can be transformed into a home by the simple, powerful act of choosing to belong to one another.